The north wind had combed the yellow grass flat along Chalk Mesa, dragging a low white scud of cloud like wool across a fence. The country lay spare and honest. A skin of dust, a bone of stone, the blue far line of hills cut thin as a blade. Cattle stood in pairs, facing nothing. The sun, still low, threw a copper light that made every nailhead shine in the posts, and every thorn carry its own shadow. It smelled of dry iron and old rain. Abram Kestrel rode the fence at a walk, his coat dark where the dew had touched it and gone. He had a big quiet way with the reins, as though the horse were only a thought he kept returning to. The ranch house stood back from the wind like a man who had learned to square himself before talk grew mean. Boards creaked. A bucket thumped against the well stone. He counted bales in his head without looking at them because it steadied him, the way a tally of small, fixed things could make a morning hold. He did not sing. He had once, when there were 2 rooms lit at night and a pair of boots left beside a smaller pair. Those nights had passed like a river under ice. He let them pass still. Silence kept him company. He turned the gelding at the far corner where the fence leaned into a draw. There the ground carried a scatter of old tins and a coil of wire rusted clean through. He saw the thing then, a thin tongue of metal, no longer than a child's finger, bent at one end and pierced, with a twist of red thread tied through it like a small, defiant flag. A harmonica reed freed from its box and forgotten, the little machine heart of a lost tune. He took it up and turned it in his glove. The sun snagged on its edge, a note that had outlived the song. He slipped it into his pocket without a plan and rode on. The wind pushed at his hat brim. The country stayed close to its truth. In town, Mara Voss stood before a glass that did not forgive. The mercantile window showed her as a narrow woman with a shawl gone thin and a mouth that had learned not to speak first. She held a paper sack of flour and a small wedge of lard wrapped in wax. Behind the counter, the owner measured out pennies and pity with the same spoon. She said she would work. She said she could boil beans, mend, keep a fire. Her voice came out even and soft. She did not tell the man that the nights were the worst, when the stove clicked in its cooling and the wind set its shoulder to the door. She did not tell him she feared her own hunger most. On the walk she paused by the hitch rail and watched a pair of boys play at roping a crate. One laughed at the way her dress hung. The elbows shined smooth with wear. She lowered her gaze and moved on. Her husband had been a small man with quick fingers and a grin that lit and died like a match. A fever took him in a week. The grave took him for good. Since then, the world had seemed made of rooms where she did not belong. She kept to the edges of talk, the outer ring of warmth, the back pew. She did not ask for mercy. She asked for work and a little bread. She walked out of town with the sun behind her like an open door she could not step back through. Dust rose around her hem and settled again. Undecided. The road to the Kestrel place cut straight and then wavered at the wash, as if tired of being sure. A hawk turned slow over the flats, and the shadow of it crossed her face. She did not flinch. A wagon passed, and the driver looked at her long, then looked away in the manner of men who believe they have done kindness by not saying what they were about to say. She kept going. At the ranch gate, she stopped to breathe and to smooth her hair where the wind had taken it. The boards of the gate wore the scars of cattle noses and years. On the post hung a line of oddments. Bent nails, a horseshoe stone, a key with no door. She saw, nailed higher than her reach, a small loop of red thread caught on a splinter. It matched something she could not name. She thought of a song she could not quite remember. She heard nothing but the wind. She stepped through and onto Kestrel ground. On the porch, Abram set the tin cup down and stood. And for a moment, neither of them moved. The light hooked across the brim of his hat. The flour sack weighed her arms. "Sir," she said at last, and the word felt like crossing water. He nodded once. "I can work," she said, "for food." The wind answered first. Then the door creaked, and the day went on, and the thin, hidden reed in his pocket lay quiet as if listening for breath. The sun leaned west, drawing long amber bars through the slats of the porch. Dust rode the air, slow and golden. Abram Kestrel studied the woman on his threshold with the patience of a man who'd learned not to expect much from the world. Her shawl clung to her like bark to a dying tree, and her shoes looked better suited for prayer than walking. He said nothing for a time. The quiet between them was a kind of weighing. "You can cook?" he asked finally. She nodded. "And scrub, mend, haul. Whatever keeps the place decent." He looked past her, down the road she had come by. No wagon, no kin, no shadow following. The prairie lay open and merciless. "Ain't much decent about this place," he said. "Then maybe it needs someone who knows indecency firsthand," she murmured, voice nearly lost to the wind. He studied that line in her face, that mixture of shame and defiance. He found himself admiring both. "Come in then," he said, and the boards under her boots answered with a tired groan. Inside, the air smelled of iron, old leather, and coffee boiled too long. The walls held dust in the seams like a memory that wouldn't leave. She placed the sack of flour on the table, set her hands flat beside it. Abram leaned his rifle against the wall and poured water from a pitcher, sliding a tin cup toward her. She drank too quickly, like someone afraid it might be taken back. "You can stay in the loft," he said. "It ain't proper, maybe, but it's dry. I've known worse than improper." He nodded. That much, he believed. He left her there and stepped out to the barn, pretending to check the latch. In truth, he needed the open air, the sound of a living creature breathing. Through the slats, he watched her move about the kitchen, small but sure, clearing the cold ashes, striking a match, coaxing flame as though she'd done it her whole life. When he came back in, she'd found beans in a tin and a strip of dried meat. She stirred both into a pot, standing close to the stove's growing heat. Her eyes glistened from the smoke, but she didn't wipe them. They ate at the table without talk. The silence had a rhythm to it, the clink of spoons, the sigh of wind. Outside, the prairie folded into dusk. Coyotes called far off, and the moon drew a thin silver thread over the fence line. Abram leaned back in his chair. "You'll start early," he said. "Cows to feed, roof needs mending." "I'll earn every crumb," she replied. He nodded, not from agreement, but because something inside him had already settled that she would. Before she climbed the loft ladder, she set a small thing on the windowsill. A tin harmonica reed polished clean and tied with a twist of red thread. He asked, "You keep that for luck?" Her voice came soft. "For remembering." Then she disappeared into the shadows of the loft, leaving him with the smell of wood smoke and a thought he couldn't quite name. Later that night, Abram sat alone by the cold stove, the reed glinting faintly in the lamplight. He took it in his hand, rubbed the thread between his fingers, and felt the faintest hum, like a note caught in the breath of silence. He wondered whose song it had been, and whether it might one day find its way home. Morning came without ceremony. The sky was the pale color of dishwater, and frost had crept up the window like something ashamed of itself. Mara was already outside before Abram rose. He found her bent at the well, pulling the rope hand over hand, the pulley whining. The water came up dark as pewter, and she steadied the bucket with her knee. The sleeves of her dress rolled to the elbows. Her arms were thin but steady. Her breath smoked in the cold air. "You start early," he said from the porch. "I don't sleep much," she replied, without looking up. He watched her a moment longer, then went to saddle the bay. The mare shifted beneath his touch, uneasy with the frost's sharp smell. By the time he returned from the ridge, the house had changed. The dishes were stacked, the floor swept, a curtain mended with rough but patient stitching. The fire burned clear and honest. He saw her sitting by it, trimming beans, her hair unbound, glinting like wheat at dusk. It startled him how quiet the house had become. Quiet not from emptiness, but from being kept. In town, the talk began as soft as flower dust. That widow from the flats, Mara Voss, had taken to the Kestrel place. Some said she'd come crawling, others that the rancher was lonely enough to hire shadows if they'd sweep. At the feed store, two men joked that she was earning her bread the way widows did best, and the laughter that followed had no joy in it. Abram heard bits of it when he came in for supplies. He said nothing. He had never been a man to argue what wind carried. But when one of the men at the counter winked and said, "She must cook fine, that one," Abram set his coin on the counter hard enough that the till rattled. "Beans," he said. "She cooks beans." Then he walked out before they could think what to say. That night, Mara found the reed missing from the sill. She searched the shelf, the floor, the corner where the draft ran strongest. When she found it at last, it hung from a nail above the stove, tied by its thread, turning gently in the heat's small wind. "Figured it ought to stay where it can sing," Abram said from the doorway. She looked at him, uncertain whether it was kindness or claim. He tipped his hat slightly and went out to the corral, leaving her with the sound of the reed turning. A faint, trembling whisper like a word the house hadn't learned to say. The days grew ordered. He would ride out early, return by dusk. She would have supper set. Sometimes he'd catch her standing by the porch rail, watching the horizon as though someone might walk out of it. Sometimes she'd see him at the window, hat in his hands, as if trying to remember what men used to do before the world took softness from them. Then, one afternoon, the pastor's wife rode out, carrying gossip disguised as piety. "Folk are saying you found yourself company, Mr. Kestrel." He said nothing. "They say you've let sin under your roof." He looked at her with the same steady calm he used on skittish stock. "Sin's been here long before either of us, ma'am." She swallowed that and rode home without blessing the yard. When Mara asked later what the woman had wanted, he said only, "Charity's worse than hunger sometimes." She nodded slowly, understanding more than he meant her to. That night, a thin snow began to fall. She stood in the doorway, watching it collect in the troughs. Behind her, the harmonica reed quivered faintly in the stove's draft. And in that small sound, a note without breath, lay the first fragile thing they shared. Not love, not safety, only the mercy of being seen. The wind turned soft for a week, the kind of warmth that made men forget winter still waited in the hills. Snowmelt ran in little silver veins through the pasture, and the horses rolled in the thawed earth like children waking from a long sleep. Mara scrubbed the porch till the boards shone pale as new bone. When Abram came back from the creek, she was on her knees, hair pulled loose, hands raw from soap. "You don't have to shine the world," he said gently. She looked up. "Sometimes it shines me back." He stood there longer than he meant to, his shadow falling across her arms. Then he bent, picked up the loose board by the step, and fixed it without another word. That was how kindness passed between them, quiet, practical, half hidden in work. At night she cooked what she could: bean stew, corn mash, a pie made from the last jar of peaches she'd bartered for months ago. He never said it was good. He never said it wasn't. But she noticed he always left his spoon upright in the empty bowl, a gesture small and deliberate, as if to say this was worth finishing. Once, after supper, she found his boots by the fire. The right sole had torn loose from its stitching. She took needle and twine, mended it while he slept upright in his chair. When he woke, he saw the boot beside the hearth, neatly patched. "You shouldn't waste your thread on old leather," he murmured. "It holds," she said. He bent and ran his thumb along the seam, then set the boot back where she'd placed it. "It does." The days slowed. A red hawk nested in the cottonwood by the fence. The nights grew blue and long. Sometimes she'd wake in the loft to the sound of the harmonica reed stirring faintly in the stove's draft, a fragile hum like a heart practicing how to speak again. She would lie there listening until sleep came, and with it a strange, reluctant peace. Then one evening, after he returned from town carrying a new sack of flour. He looked uneasy, as if he'd done something foolish. Couldn't find white, he said, setting it down. Only coarse ground. She smiled faintly. The coarse kind lasts longer. He nodded, relieved by her answer, though he couldn't say why. From his coat he drew a small bundle wrapped in paper, buttons, a spool of red thread, and a bar of soap cut to look like carved ivory. He set it on the table without comment. She opened it slowly. For a moment, her breath caught. "You bought these?" "Traded," he said. "Didn't seem right, you patchin' with twine." Her eyes glistened, and she blinked quickly, hiding the wet. "Thank you, Mr. Kestrel." He started to say something, but stopped, letting the silence settle instead. Sometimes silence carried more truth than talk ever could. That night, he found the harmonica reed hanging by the lamp again. It turned in the glow, catching the light. He thought how strange it was. One little thing of no use, yet somehow it made the whole house sound alive. He wondered if she'd brought the sound with her, or if maybe it had been waiting there all this time for her to come back and wake it. Outside, coyotes called over the flats. Mara sat by the window, mending one of his shirts with the new red thread, her fingers moving steady and slow. From where he stood, Abram saw her face lit by lamplight, tired, calm, marked by something like grace. He thought, maybe this is how the world forgives. Quietly, through small, worn hands. A long silence took hold of the plains that spring, the kind that made a man listen too closely to his own breathing. The creek ran low, a thin murmur under reeds gone brittle. Dust lay on everything like a warning. Abram fixed fence posts, mended troughs, counted cattle, but each task pulled loose a thread of memory. One morning he rode the south ridge and saw the cottonwood stump where his boy had once carved his name. The letters had blurred under weather, eaten by age and sun, yet he could still trace the curve of the A. He dismounted and laid a hand there, felt the cool, rough bark. The wind whispered through, low and dry. He stood there until his horse nickered softly, asking to go. When he came back, Mara was bent over the wash basin, sleeves soaked to her elbows. Her hair clung to her temples. Her hands were red from the cold. He stopped in the doorway, watching the rhythm of her work, the steadiness. "You ever lose someone?" he asked. She paused, as if unsure whether it was a question meant to be answered. Then quietly, "Everyone I ever tried to keep." The words dropped like pebbles into a well. He nodded once and stepped away, knowing better than to ask what that meant. That night, as she cooked, she hummed under her breath. Soft, tuneless, more a memory of music than a melody. It caught him by surprise. He hadn't heard a voice in this house that wasn't his own in years. He set down his cup and listened. When she noticed, she stopped. "Don't mind me," she said. "My husband used to play harmonica when he was drunk enough to forget himself. The sound sticks in me sometimes." He didn't answer. He reached up and touched the reed that hung near the lamp. It swung faintly. "Maybe it's not the song you remember," he said after a moment. "Maybe it's the silence after." She met his eyes across the small kitchen. The firelight moved between them like a living thing. Days stretched into sameness. Work, water, feed, mending, meal. The land had its rhythm, hard, simple, merciless. But one evening, as she was stacking kindling, a sound broke that rhythm. Far off, faint, the rasp of a harmonica. A cowboy's tune, maybe, carried on the wind from the trail road. Mara froze. The knife in her hand stilled. The tune was jagged, off-key, like a drunk remembering a prayer. Her eyes went empty for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice trembled. "That's what he used to play, before the fever, before he sold the wagon." Abram didn't move closer. He only said, "He must have been good once." She shook her head. "No, but he believed he was. That was enough to keep me hoping. He said nothing more. He watched the pain rise and fade like wind across a wheat field, swift, ungraspable. Later that night, he found her outside, sitting on the steps, bare feet in the cold dust. The moon was thin as a coin. He handed her a blanket and sat beside her without a word. After a time, she said, "Do you ever wonder if God forgets people on purpose?" He looked at the sky, at the scattered stars. "I used to think he was keeping count. Now I think he's keeping quiet." She turned her head toward him then, the lamplight catching the wet in her lashes. He saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. Not as a servant, not as a burden, but as someone trying to outlast her own sorrow. He stood slowly, meaning to leave before the air grew too thick with things unsaid. As he turned, she spoke again, almost a whisper. "If he is keeping quiet, maybe it's our turn to speak." The wind stirred the harmonica reed hanging by the door. It gave a single, trembling note, softer than breath, lonelier than prayer. And in that sound, two lives, once broken by loss, shifted slightly toward one another. The days turned colorless. The air grew thin, and the smell of dust carried farther than voices. Out on the flats, the earth cracked in narrow seams like old porcelain. The creek, once talkative, fell silent, its bed a streak of gray stone, dry as paper. Cattle wandered the fence line searching for water that wasn't there. The sky stayed brass and hard. Even the crows had flown east. Abram woke before dawn each day and listened for rain the way other men listened for prayer. There was none. He went about his work anyway, boots sinking into powder where soil used to be. Inside, Mara rationed water with a miser's care. One dipper for washing, one for cooking, one for the tin basin that held what little mercy was left. She boiled beans in silence. The house creaked in the heat like a body bearing pain without complaint. When she set a cup before Abram that evening, he looked into it as though the dark water might confess something. "Won't hold much longer," he said. "The land or the people?" "Both," he answered. That night, wind rose like a fever. The curtains lifted, then dropped again. The lantern flame tilted and shivered. Mara climbed to the loft, but sleep wouldn't come. Through the window, she could see lightning crawling behind the horizon, silent, cruel, too far to matter. She thought of her husband's grave by the dry creek, the wooden cross lying flat since the last storm. She thought of the harmonica he'd buried with him, how she'd broken the reed off to keep one note alive. Below, Abram sat at the table, a ledger open before him. No numbers, just an empty page, the pen still capped. He stared at it as though the right words might bring rain. When thunder finally spoke, it came from deep in the belly of the plains, a sound older than faith. By morning, the air was electric and mean. The sun rose pale and sharp, the wind turning circles in the dust. The smell of something burning came faintly from the south. Abram saddled the mare. "Fire," he said. Chaparral sighed. Mara followed him out to the yard, her skirt whipping around her legs. "You'll go alone?" He nodded once. "I have to. If it crosses the ridge, it'll take the herd." She reached for him without thinking, her fingers brushing the edge of his coat. "Then take water," she said, pressing a tin canteen into his hand. "And the thread, tie your hat with it. The wind'll strip you bare." He looked down. It was the red thread that once bound her harmonica reed. He tied it without a word. Then he mounted, the horse restless beneath him, and rode out into the rising heat. Through the day, she worked like one trying to hold the world together with small hands, filling every bucket, sealing the shutters, dragging feed sacks from the barn to keep them from catching flame. The horizon was a moving wall of smoke now, black and red, the air choked with ash that turned noon into dusk. She coughed, wiped her face with her apron, and kept hauling water from the well until her arms trembled. The pump groaned. The rope burned her palms. But she did not stop. By late afternoon, Embers rode the wind. They landed in the yard, in her hair, in the folds of her dress. She beat them out with her hands, tasting iron and fear. She thought of Abram somewhere out there in the smoke, fighting to turn cattle through a fire that did not forgive. And she thought, if the world burns tonight, let it burn knowing I stayed. She tied a wet rag around her mouth and kept working. The wind screamed. The reed above the door whistled a high, ghostly note, as if calling his name into the dark. And the sky, at last, opened. Not with rain, but with flame. The first sparks came crawling over the ridge like fireflies gone mad. Then the whole horizon rippled and broke open, orange swallowing black, black swallowing sky. The wind carried heat that felt alive, hunting. Mara stood in the yard barefoot, a bucket in each hand. Her eyes burned from smoke, her lungs rasping with dust and dread. The horses screamed from the corral, kicking against the rails. Chickens clattered under the porch, feathers turning to ash in the air. She ran from trough to trough, flinging water where flame had not yet reached. The world had no edges anymore. Only sound, smoke, and color. Inside, the lamp fell and shattered. Glass hissed in the heat. The curtains caught, and the little kitchen where she'd once sung became a breathing mouth of fire. She thought of leaving then, thought of the long road, the creek bed, the chance that somewhere beyond the blaze the air was still clean. But her hands didn't move. They seized another bucket. Her body chose before her mind could. "This house fed me," she whispered. "I'll feed it back what I can." She beat at the flames with a blanket, hair singeing, skin blistering. When the smoke grew thick enough to blind, she crawled on the floor, found the reed hanging by the door, tore it free, and pressed it to her chest. Out on the far range, Abram rode with the herd, eyes stinging, hat tied down with that twist of red thread she'd given him. The cattle moved like a single dark tide, lowing in panic. He shouted them toward the dry cut north of the ridge, where the ground dipped and wind thinned. The fire chased from behind, fast and sure as judgment. He lost sight of half the herd to the smoke and turned back. Mad with the thought of her, the widow with bare hands and a house made of dry boards. He spurred the horse into the burning wind. By the time he reached the yard, half the roof had gone. He dismounted into ash, calling her name once, then again, but his throat gave out. Through the roar, he saw her silhouette in the doorway, bent but standing, a shape cut from light and ruin. He ran, caught her arm, dragged her into the open just as the beam above them cracked and fell, shattering where she'd stood. They tumbled into the dirt, coughing, his coat smoking, her palms raw and bleeding. "I told you to go," he rasped. She shook her head. "You told me this land was worth something. I believed you." He wanted to speak, to scold, to bless, to say you fool or you brave thing, but there was no breath left for language. Only the pounding of her heart against his shoulder, faster than the fire, louder than the wind. When the worst had passed, they crawled toward the pump. The air shimmered, still hot enough to twist the light. He cranked the handle, it squealed, then gave. Water burst out in a brown stream. She plunged her burned hands into it and laughed, a sound wild and raw, half sob, half miracle. He looked at her and saw in her face not the widow he'd hired, but the last honest part of the world, refusing to die. She took the harmonica reed from her pocket, pressed it into his palm, her fingers closing over his. "For luck," she said hoarsely, or remembering. He tied it to his hat string beside the red thread. Both blackened now, both holding. They stayed like that till the sky dimmed to bruised blue. The barn was gone, half the fence too. The house smoked, skeletal but standing. He turned to her, ash streaked across his jaw. "You'll freeze tonight if we stay here," he said. "Then we'll freeze together," she answered. For the first time in years, he did not argue with another soul. The last light caught the reed and made it shine like a living ember between them. And the wind, cooled at last, carried its faintest note, a single sound of breath returning to the broken land. The wind went still after the fire. Ash fell slow as snow, soft enough to look merciful if you didn't know what it was. The land had changed its color. No green, no gold, only gray. They sat by the pump, both trembling, both half ghosts in the dawn. When the sun lifted, the smoke thinned enough to show the bones of the house still standing, one wall gone, the roof split like a wound. Abram rose first. His knees cracked like breaking twigs. Mara tried to stand, but her legs folded. He caught her under the arms, felt how light she'd become. Her face was gray with soot, her lips bloodless, her eyes open but not seeing. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm here," she whispered. "That's enough." He lifted her like a child and carried her into what was left of the house. He laid her on the cot under the part of roof still holding and went to fetch what water remained. The bucket's rope burned his hands, but he didn't notice. When he came back, she was shaking, not from fear now, but from the cold that always follows heat. He knelt and wiped her face with the damp cloth, each stroke slow, as if washing away years. By afternoon, the ranch lay quiet. No birds, no cattle. The wind held its breath. He spent the day walking the perimeter, counting what could still be saved. Tools buried in soot, fence posts scorched black but standing. When he came back, the light had gone soft again. Mara was awake, sitting against the wall, her hair loose, her palms bandaged. He sat beside her without a word. She said, "You should have left me." "I tried," he said simply. Her mouth trembled. A weak laugh slipped out. "I used to pray for a man to tell me that." He looked down. "Don't make it more than it was. I couldn't stand another ghost on this land." Her eyes turned to him, tired and shining. "Then you'll have to live with me instead." That night the sky broke open again, not with fire, but with rain. It came sudden, reckless, drumming the ashes flat. The water hissed over the ruins, turning smoke to steam, dust to mud. They ran outside, both bareheaded. Mara tipped her face upward, her bandaged hands open to the downpour. Her laugh carried over the thunder, a sound raw and free. Abram stood still, letting the water soak his coat, run down his face. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he thought gone for good. When she stumbled from the wet, he caught her again. This time she didn't pull away. The rain grew colder, heavier. He guided her back under the eave that still stood. She pressed the tin reed into his palm again, her fingers trembling. "If it's got any song left," she said, "let it sing for what's left of us." He closed his hand around it, felt its edge bite into his skin. Then he held it up to the wind. The rain made it hum, a faint, quivering tone that might have been sorrow, might have been grace. By morning the rain had gone and the land steamed. He woke before her, found her still asleep, her face turned toward the light. For a long moment he just watched, her breath slow, the corners of her mouth faintly curved, her hand resting on the cot's frame as though testing if the world would still hold her. He thought, "It does." Outside, the first bird since the fire called once from the cottonwood stump. He stepped out into the wet earth, the red thread still tied around his hat, the reed darkened but whole. The day smelled of smoke and beginnings, and for the first time in years, Abram Kestrel whispered a thank you to the sky, to the silence, to whatever mercy had decided, for one more morning, to spare them both. When the road reopened, word spread quick as wildfire had come. Kestrel's ranch had burned, but the man and the widow lived. By the week's end, wagons began to roll in. Neighbors, onlookers, men with measuring eyes and easy pity. They came to help, they said, but their glances held more curiosity than kindness. One offered to buy the herd that survived, half its worth, maybe less. Another said, "A place that's burned once will burn again, Abram. Best take what you can and head east." Abram stood by the gatepost, hat in his hands. boots sunk in mud. Mara watched from the porch, her bandaged fingers folded tight. He said nothing at first. Then, "This land remembers who stays, and I intend to stay." The men exchanged looks, muttered something about pride, then left in a line of wagons that threw more dust than help. Later that day, the preacher's wife came again, carrying a basket that smelled of starch and judgment. She looked past Abram toward Mara, who was hauling wood with her burned hands. "It's not fitting," the woman began. "Her living here alone, the town speaks." Abram's gaze didn't waver. "Then let the town do its talking. It's all most of them are good at." The woman's face pinched tighter than her bonnet string. She left without setting the basket down. When she was gone, Mara stood still, staring at her hands. "She's right," she said quietly. "It's not fitting." Abram turned to her, slow. "You saved this place. Half those men wouldn't stand in smoke for their own kin. You did it for mine." She shook her head. "I did it because I couldn't stand losing another home." He stepped closer. The rain-swollen boards creaked under his weight. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "You stay because I want you here, and if that offends them, they can pray harder." She looked up at him then, eyes wet but unafraid. "Want me how, Abram Kestrel?" He breathed once, hard. "Not as a servant, not as a shadow, as someone who knows what silence costs." The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Steam lifted off the blackened field, curling toward the pale sky like ghosts leaving for good. He took the reed from his hat and held it out to her. "Hang it by the door again," he said. "It belongs here." She tied it with the same red thread, now faded to rust. When the wind caught it, the sound came thin but certain, a single clear note, the voice of something that refused to die. That evening she cooked what little they had left: corn, a strip of meat, coffee dark enough to hide the taste of smoke. They ate slow, watching the sun settle behind the ridge. When she rose to wash the tin plates, he stopped her with a hand on her wrist. "Sit," he said softly. She did. He poured her a second cup and pushed it across the table. "Tomorrow, I'll rebuild the barn. You'll need a roof for your things." "My things?" she asked, a faint smile touching her lips. He nodded. "What's mine's yours, if you'll have it." She looked down at her cup, at the small tremor in her bandaged fingers. Then she said, "I don't need much, Abram, just a place where the silence doesn't hurt." He smiled, just barely. "Then we've already built half of it." Outside, the wind picked up again, stirring ash and seed together in the soil. The reed above the door trembled, found its voice, and the faintest melody rose from it. A sound caught between morning and promise. It carried out across Chalk Mesa, through the burned pasture and the creek bed reborn with water, a hymn for the living who had refused to leave. By morning, the world had quieted into forgiveness. Mist rolled low over Chalk Mesa, silver and slow, softening what the fire had ruined. The air smelled of damp ash and grass trying to return. Abram rose before the light and went out barefoot. The ground, still warm beneath, held a pulse. He bent and pushed a shovel into the earth, turning over the black soil, making lines for seed. The rhythm steadied him. Work as prayer, sweat as confession. When he looked up, Mara stood at the porch, wrapped in a blanket, hair loose in the morning wind. The thin smoke of a rekindled fire rose behind her. "Breakfast'll be ready soon," she said. He nodded, but she didn't go back inside. She came down the steps, bare feet sinking into the mud beside his. She took the second shovel leaning by the fence, its handle darkened from age, and set it to the soil beside his own. For a while, neither spoke. The sun crested the ridge, laying gold on their faces, on the broken barn, on the empty trough that waited to fill again. By midday, she swept the house while he fixed the roof beam. Every blow of his hammer echoed like a heartbeat through the hollow boards. She hummed softly under it, not a tune but a sound to keep the silence company. They ate what little remained, bread hard at the edges, water sweet from the pump. She had cleaned the tin reed the night before, polished it till it caught the light like a sliver of dawn. Now it hung above the doorway again, the red thread a brighter thing against the pale wood. When wind slipped through the open window, the reed shivered, giving a single trembling note. It hung in the air longer than seemed possible. Toward evening, they walked the ridge where the fire had started. Black stumps stood like prayers half burned, and shoots of green were already pushing through. Mara stopped, knelt, and touched one of the new stems. "It comes back," she said softly, "even when it shouldn't." He watched her fingers trace the small, bright leaf. "So do we." She looked up at him then, eyes bright, cheeks streaked with soil and light. "You mean to build it all again?" "All we can," he said. "The rest we let be." When dusk fell, they sat on the porch together, neither owning the silence, only sharing it. The red sky bled into violet, then into dark. Crickets began, hesitant at first, then sure. She folded her hands in her lap, eyes on the horizon. "Do you ever think the world keeps starting over just to see if we'll stay this time?" He considered it a long while. Maybe. Or maybe it just needs witnesses. She smiled at that, tired, kind, a smile made for the end of storms. He rose, went inside, and returned with 2 plates, setting one beside her. Steam rose faintly from the bread. He pulled another chair close, the wood creaking, and sat. For the first time since the fire, they ate as 2 who had chosen the same place, not because it was easy, but because it was true. When the stars came out, the wind rose again, brushing through the door where the tin reed hung. Its note drifted out into the open night, thin, steady, tender. Abram looked toward it and said quietly, "Let it sing." Mara listened, her eyes soft, her breath slow. "It already is." And when dawn returned, the real kind, clear and gold, spilling over the mesa like forgiveness, the harmonica reed whispered once more in that small wind, carrying its single shining note through the house, over the field, across the waking earth. A note of things mended, not perfect. A note of staying. He set another place, and she filled it.